My second semester at Syracuse University, I took a course called Introduction to System Administration. And in the beginning of the class, the first couple of days, the instructor set out a couple topics for debate. The way it was set up was he would give the topics and you would choose which topic you wanted to be a part of, whether you wanted to be for or against a specific product or technique. I think the options were data center versus cloud, something about Google Mail or Google Suite versus Microsoft Suite, the Google Doc, Google Sheet, Slide versus Microsoft, whatever they call their stuff. And I do believe that included Gmail and Hotmail? Outlook. Yeah, included Outlook, I believe. And I remembered that part because there was a hang up somewhere in the middle of their debate where they talked about video chat between Skype and Google Voice. And I brought up that it doesn't matter because Jitsi is the greatest. It's going to take over the entire world because I was a fanboy like that at the time. Now, the entire room pretty much went quiet when I had no idea what he said. But the idea for this podcast came about because I recently wrote a blog post for Syracuse University, a iSchool blog called InfoSpace, talking about how I use open source software in the classroom or for classes. And in the middle of writing, I pulled out my external drive and I found the slideshow, the original slideshow for this debate. Oh, I didn't even say anything. What debate I did? I did Linux Ubuntu server versus Windows server. It is good to cover that way after I should have, right? Unless I put it on the screen already. So I'm in the middle of writing this blog post for InfoSpace. And I'm thinking, you know what? It'd be cool. Maybe I should do a blog post talking about doing this presentation. Kill two birds with one stone. I'm talking a little bit about the class, even though I already have an ISTA 346 podcast that I think was an actual podcast because it was at least 15 minutes long. But this one is very specific to Linux, can work as some type of intro into some of the stuff I'll be releasing in the later dates throughout the year about getting into Linux, as I'll be talking about a couple issues that many people bring out, or myths or common setbacks, perceived or otherwise, about using Linux and open source software. So I have this blog post on GoLiveLoudly.com titled Linux Ubuntu Server versus Windows Server. For now, I might change that. And I have the slideshow. I have the original slideshow, except for I pulled the names off because I didn't want to use someone else's name, without their permission. So I figured if I just be honest about who did what, me, not me, all should be just fine for the most part. Otherwise, I guess because interwebs, you'll find out about it sooner or later anyway, right? So the first slide is obviously not ours. Pulled it. It's a beautiful slide, I think. And I need to find out where I got it from so I can give them the actual credit for it. Moving over to slide 2. I did not create this slide. It's a short background about Microsoft Windows and Linux. I'm not going to talk about much of this. Linux was started by Linus Torvalds. He's still alive. And as it shows up here, the easiest example for Linux would be Android. Because Android is what a lot of people use. They don't notice Linux. Well, the Linux kernel with, I believe, was a Java VM running on top of it. You can't simply run software. You can't simply run Linux software on Android or vice versa. It's not that simple. It can be done. There is a Android OS for the computer titled Remix OS. If you're curious about getting Android on your laptop, there's your answer. Remix OS. So as I said, this isn't my slide. Going to slide 3. What is an operating system? Yep, I didn't do this slide either. I'm not covering it. It's got basic information. I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence. Objectives when securing the OS, which is actually applicable. Like slide 3. This slide 4 is very applicable. What are some objectives? Well, the servers, making sure your server maintenance and account management and your monitoring for potential security threat. Filler, right? Well, here's what it is. All right, now we're getting closer to my tangent that I went on. Well, why do most people use Windows in general? Well, it's pre-installed on most laptops. It's available on computers cheaper than Apple. Present in most work environments. and everything else is, it's more about being used to it already. A lot of people that use Mac OS X do so because it is a single point of failure. That doesn't mean that they fail. That just means that it's a one-stop shop, which is good. And at times, it's got its pros and cons, of course. The major pro is that when you need help with it, is one particular person. There isn't, well, let me send an email to Microsoft. Let me send an email to Dell or HP or Compaq or Asus, etc. It is, hey, Mac, I have this issue. Hopefully you have this warranty, or otherwise I guess you're just screwed. And because they get less malware issues, which they get less malware issues because most people are using Windows, home and work environment. They go where the money is. With the hackers do the exact same thing. So pushing over to slide 6, and this is where I get deep into my tangent. Actually, let's see. I covered up until, I'm not sure if I covered slide 6. Well, yeah, I'm pretty sure I wrote it, or at least most of it. Yeah, I wrote this. I'm not sure if I briefed it though. Whatever. Pros of using Linux. There's actually over 200 Linux distributions available on DistroWatch.com, and there are a couple I've come across that aren't even listed. I forgot the names of them, but throwing that out there for different niches or different specific uses, customization, better security, free support. Of course, it's a very subjective term. I had this conversation with someone once. I think it was a professor, and that was a gripe that the professor put out, the fact that there was no ASAP support available, which, depending on how you look at it, yeah, the best word, I guess, is specified. No, in place. I can't think of the best word for it, but there isn't a support team on staff that you can call, and in the moment you call, somebody will pick up that phone immediately and help you out. I brought up the fact that there are IRC channels, the Internet Relay Chat that you can use in a Freenode network. Is it Freenode? And there's also GimpNet. There's a couple on GimpNet, and you can check those out on Freenode. Merc, Mibit. Yeah, I can't think of the other ones. I think Merc was somewhat popular. HetchChat is the default IRC desktop app installed on a lot of Linux distros I've used. So, between the IRCs and the forums, then, and you're looking for something ASAP, those two things may or may not they won't always give you what you need. So, again, subjective. Free Libre open source softwares, alternatives. I've gotten real big into that. I won't talk about much of that right now. And, of course, free being at the bottom of the list. Now, I'm sure at this point, this was where slide 7 and above was where I started yapping about the different options. DistroWatch.com, and this screenshot on the right side of what are the most popular distros or operating systems, because, it's always good to have pretty graphics, right? Mint was definitely, of course, at the top, along with Debian, Ubuntu. Where's Red Hat? Is Red Hat up here? Let me see. Synos is at number 8. Fedora number 5. Arch at 9. Kali at 12. And I do not see Red Hat. Let me look one more time. I'm going to be sure. Red Hat. RHEL? No. FreeBSD is up there. That's completely irrelevant to anything I've covered on my blog. But I put the same information up there. A lot of operating systems based on Linux to choose from. And I think at this point I made a point to say that Linux, Ubuntu Server, and Ubuntu, they're not all completely synonymous. They're not all exactly the same. Linux is a kernel. Ubuntu is an operating system for the desktop user. We didn't use Ubuntu in IST 346. We use we use Ubuntu Server, and then we installed the XFCE or Xubuntu desktop environment to make life a little easier for some of the tasks we were doing. Probably say more or less of that during the presentation. Let's see. Good old slide 8. These are stock images for Mint Cinnamon, the options for downloading Mint. And as you can see, this has absolutely nothing to do with Linux Ubuntu Server versus Windows Server. I've said nothing about Windows Server. At this point, I was focusing so much on making it known that there's more to Linux than just the command line. So pretty pictures, and obviously, well, as you can see, these two operating systems are very similar to Windows. They have the same similar start menu, taskbar at the bottom look going on. Zorin was meant to be, I won't say it's meant to be, but it has options for mirroring, I think, Windows 7 and Windows XP. And they also have something for GNOME, classic GNOME, if I remember correctly. Nonetheless, both Ubuntu based, so I'm pretty sure I made a point of that. Let's see, on slide 9, I threw out some prettier pictures, and I'm not sure how much of a jerk I made myself look like when I asked if anybody in the room was Chinese, and I looked at someone that was Asian, and they looked away with this crazy face going, no. Turned out she was Vietnamese. But no one raised their hand for being Chinese. But I made a point to show that Linux Deepin was a flagship operating system for Linux from China. Yeah, I know someone's probably thinking right now, well, what about Ubuntu, Krillin? And my answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know much about Krillin. But Ubuntu Studio, the screenshot for Ubuntu Studio had a really pretty doc in there from CaroDoc. Let's see. Slide 10 was actually somewhat more content. No, still filler. Well, no, not filler. Just completely irrelevant to the debate. Just a lot of examples as to where Linux is, even if you don't know it. The Philippines government using Fedora and Ubuntu. One Laptop Per Child, which is an organization that they have a distribution that is actually on distrowatch.com for Linux. Google or Ubuntu, I think that's changed. They did something else at some point. I don't remember what. Wikipedia with Ubuntu. PS3 was some yellow dog Linux thing that I think they got rid of it and then they AOK'd it again. And I put a screenshot of this software or system used in the military called Force Battle Command Brigade and Below, or FBCB2 or BFT, Blue Force Tracker. And again, it's still screenshots and examples as to, I'm hounding on Linux is in front of your face, whether you know it or not, with all these examples, because fanboy, that was the biggest thing that I knew would be some type of a issue in regards to the debate. Well, I'll say it held some weight in regards to people raising their hands at the end and saying which side they would be more likely to go with if they were in the position to choose. Slide 11 was when I actually said something that was worth paying attention to in regards to the debate. Talked about open source software security, and I found one article within the Syracuse University Library in regards to open source software, which I could find a link. I should probably put the link in my blog post with this slideshow, where if I recall correctly, it simply said that between whether it's open source software or closed source, it doesn't really make too much of a difference as far as security or which is more secure, because, well, reasons between proprietary means you can't simply look at the code and there are more people looking at it. Well, I'll take it back. Proprietary, there are less people looking at it, but only the specific people who work on the code can see it. Meanwhile, with open source, anyone can see the code, but a lot more people can actually look at the code. And because of that, it's a lot more community driven. There's the Launchpad and the GitHub, other bug trackers, etc., where people are paying more attention to that stuff. A lot more people can see that stuff. Anyways, on slide 11, I pointed out the fact that Windows 10 is at the bottom of the list, which is actually a good thing. Windows 10 had less vulnerabilities than the Linux kernel itself or Ubuntu Linux, while Windows Server 2012 had just a few more, 3 more, and this snapshot is from 2015. And I made a point of pointing out, hey, who wouldn't use Mac OS X for security? Look at where they are, number 1. And I even put a little link up there. So if somebody was curious for whatever reason, though, I think by that time, this was about March 2016. Yeah, by that time, that was still a thing. People knew about that. A lot of people knew about that. At this point, I made a point to point out that one of the reasons that I believed that to be at the time was the Linux kernel is meant to be open for people that need it, but it's changed depending on the operating system that you use, whether it's Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, etc. based, one of those or based on it, even Gentoo, there are certain changes made to the Linux kernel or options that you have, and you can always recompile it and take away certain drivers. For example, I believe I asked the class if anyone there had used a serial port. And I think I made the example that you take a VGA cable or a VGA port and just think of it the opposite. Instead of a female port, and it was a male port. It's a data port. I also brought up SCSI. I'm not sure if I brought up the fact that I used SCSI, and the only reason I knew about SCSI was because I had a SCSI CD-ROM drive and zip drive that daisy chained to my Core Triton as a team. That's the only reason I knew about SCSI. But I made an example that drivers like that don't need to be in the average person's Linux kernel, and that we had been taught that if you don't need something, you get rid of it. If you don't need this application, then you don't want to have to deal with the vulnerabilities that application could have for that one time that you thought you needed it, or because you just don't care to uninstall it or shred it, But I enjoy putting that up there because putting that listing up there because it brought things into perspective, and it's the one thing that actually held much weight in regards to the argument Ubuntu server versus Windows server. And from looking here, you can see that Ubuntu has slightly less, barely, vulnerabilities than Windows Server 2012, meaning that, looking at it now, you say, well, it's not too much a big deal. Well, Windows Server, more people use it, and it's easier to use because it has a GUI, right? Because it has a desktop environment that, that's universal, so that's there. Slide 12 is where I talked about some other alternatives for some of the things we had been doing. Now, during the class IC 346, we did a lot with UFW. That's all we used. We didn't use GUFW. And I'm not going to sit here and try to exaggerate my experience with Linux administration in an enterprise environment. I have absolutely none as of today. But I did want to make a point that there are GUI apps that can help you with these goals. So you don't have to be in the command line all the time, even though the command line is always more powerful than the GUI. So I threw out alternatives. I put one random image or screenshot for GUFW up there. Now I brought out the alternatives for Active Directory, Samba, Univention, OpenLDAP. For Windows Server, there's Ubuntu Server, which was supposed to be more talked about. CentOS, Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, ClearOS, and web apps that help with the same thing. Xentoo and Amahi. And then on slide 13, I go back to my open source Linux fanboy mode, talking about other alternatives, because that's just something that I'm used to having to hear about. I'm used to having to hear the issue between, well, what would I use if I'm on Linux? So that's the reason why this slide is in here. Well, what would I use for, getting paperwork done? Well, you use LibreOffice. And you can use Thunderbird, or you can use WPS or OpenOffice. Or what do I do if I need to use if I need to work on graphics? I just use GIMP. Some people seem to absolutely hate it. It does what I needed to do, especially for free. I'm not complaining. I'm also not a professional in graphic design or photography, but it does what I needed to do. They also just released, I think a few months ago, they released a theme that makes GIMP look more like Photoshop. I haven't played with it because I don't care to, but something to throw out there. Krita is real cool for drawing. That's just fun. I had no business putting up here what I use for music production or videography or print screens or using other Microsoft applications on Linux, but it's definitely there. In hindsight, as I said, one issue, once I talk about Linux, the issues or the questions that come up are, well, what applications would I use? Well, that was the purpose of me listing those. And then, you hear, oh, I need to use the command line. Well, you don't always have to use the command line. That's why slide 12 is there for the sysadmin alternatives. And as far as security, I've heard many people say, well, it's open source and it's not secure. If you find anything that says that and concludes it with a study, please send that my way. please send that to me at jtspradley@golovelively.com. Send it on my Twitter, and send it to me on Facebook. Email it. Comment it in my YouTube video or SoundCloud. Give me that. Please send that to me because I want to see it, read it, and I want to learn. I want to make sure that my on defense open source software, proprietary or closed source software, it doesn't mean too much in regards to security. It doesn't mean everything. Of course, I lean to the side of it's open source so more people can see it, and including you. And that usually means that people are more likely to be proactive on fixing bugs, the developers are, versus sitting on them, even though there have been a few cases of Linux developers doing the same thing, just being straight. But so that's why slide 11 is in there. And as I said, slide, 8 through 10? Yeah, 7 through 10. They're there to give the idea, bash it in their heads. There are desktop environments. You don't have to be in the command line to do anything. Linux is not simply a terminal. And slide 6 kind of does a little bit to, I probably should have just said that in the beginning. Slide 6 is more of is a very brief summary of everything else to come. And admittedly, a couple of times I've already said it's not very specific to Ubuntu server. It's more about Linux and open source software in general, because I knew that these were arguments that the other team was going to make against Linux. And that's also why slide 5 was here. Why do people use Windows? Well, because it's what everyone already knows. The average person I need a new laptop. You go to Walmart. Probably not going to see anything with Linux up there for a good while. If you do, let me know. That's cool. Otherwise, probably got to stick to the Think Penguin and the System 76 or whatever that XPS, the Dell XPS that I think sometimes can come directly from the manufacturer with Linux up there. And slide 5 and slide 6 are very generic and going over all of those simple reasons that people give for using Windows. And sure enough, after I finish my entire tangent of about 6 slides, our team sits down, the other team goes up there, and what do? They talk about everything against what I just said. Oh, well, Linux is hard to use. You have to be in the command line. There's no GUI for doing anything. It's hard to use, even though from what I've seen, IST 346 is the only course that actually covers Linux in the high school anyway, from what I've seen in the undergrad program. Gotta throw in those disclaimers in case somebody wants to go on a tangent against me. From what I've seen, that's all I got. All right. But yeah, that team went up there and they said those exact things. It's easier to use. Everyone already knows it. It's got commercial support, even though I usually don't think of this until the aftermath, but canonical is this. I think I brought that up in the other class with an instructor that said something also. There are times where you can pay for 24/7 support. There are a couple companies or websites you can buy this from, and you can buy support. You can purchase installation support and maintenance support for a couple months. I think OS Disk does it. Can't remember the other ones, but it's an option. And Canonical is the main backer behind Ubuntu. I'm not sure, but I would imagine they do have it. Red Hat, you're not going to just forget that. And Red Hat is a staple. So there was support there. I'm not sure how much I may have mentioned that during the presentation, but throwing that out there. In the end, what happened was what every debate was both teams will go up there and answer questions. And what basically happened was people started asking questions about Linux. One person asked about the security of Linux further in depth, and I started talking about recompiling the kernel. And for some reason, I remember saying something about the history of Linux and GNU, and I think of Richard Stallman. I don't remember why. But at some point, I ended up talking about Linux security with, recompiling the kernel and the different options and going deeper in depth. I can't remember everything from what I was asked, but people seemed, 2 or 3 people seemed really interested in what I said about Linux and kept asking questions to the point where, like I said, it kind of ruined the debate, but I got people curious about Linux, which meant a win for me. The other team didn't have very much to say because no one was asking me, it was asking me. And I do remember someone at some point asked I think they asked my team, what did they think was the best or the most interesting thing we had learned during the research. And one guy, he mentioned me and said he thought it was great to see me, interested in it. And I think in my awkward social ways, I don't think I actually responded with what I could have said, which was I've been using Linux for almost a year at this point, and I'm really interested in the community aspect and the fact that it is open source and it's meant to be more about the quality than simply making money. I didn't say too much of that. I had no idea what I said to that, but people were interested in Linux. The professor didn't even ask for people to choose side, raise your hand for which group you side with more. I don't think it got to that point because I think people were asking questions nonstop and I was answering them or trying. So it got to the point where he just cut off. I think it was the end of the class or something like that. But I enjoyed it. I called that a win. That is a victory in my book. To get people actively interested, to be able to share the word open source software and Linux, I'm happy about that. And I'm doing it again with that same slideshow in this blog post and this podcast. So after that entire tangent that said nothing about Windows Server at all and barely much about Ubuntu Server, I talked plenty about Linux and open source software and got information out there, got people interested. I'm happy with that. Go live lively.